The blizzard of 1887 didn't just bury the Wyoming Territory in snow, it buried secrets that should have stayed dead. When two desperate women, claiming to be widows of the same man, collapsed on the doorstep of the most feared recluse in the Bitterroot Mountains, they thought they were saved. They were wrong. Davis Blackwood wasn't just a lonely mountain man. He was a man waiting for a ghost. And when he looked into their eyes and said, "I never had a wife," he wasn't stating a fact. He was issuing a warning. What happened in that cabin wasn't just survival. It was a reckoning. The wind howled through the canyons of the Tetons like a dying wolf, carrying with it the promise of a freeze that could snap a man's bones. High up on the ridge, where the air was thin and the pine trees grew twisted and gnarled, sat a cabin built of rough-hewn logs that looked as ancient as the mountains themselves. Inside, Davis Blackwood sat by a roaring hearth, whittling a piece of hickory with a knife that was sharper than his temper. Davis was a man of few words and even fewer friends. At 45, his beard was shot through with iron-gray streaks, and his eyes were the color of flint, hard, cold, and unyielding. The townsfolk down in Bitter Creek whispered that Davis had once been a gentleman, perhaps even a wealthy rancher, before a tragedy turned his heart to stone. Others said he was an outlaw hiding from a hangman's noose. The truth, as it often is, was far more painful than the rumors. The storm had been raging for 2 days. Davis had enough dried venison and firewood to last him until spring, and he had no intention of stepping a foot outside until the drifts melted. But the mountains had other plans. A heavy thud against his door startled him. It wasn't the wind. It was too solid, too rhythmic. Then came a voice, faint and desperate, barely audible over the gale. "Help! For the love of God, open the door!" Davis didn't move immediately. In these parts, opening your door to strangers was a good way to get a bullet in the gut. He set down the wood carving, picked up the Winchester repeating rifle leaning against his rocking chair, and walked silently to the door. He peered through the small crack in the shutter. 2 lumps of snow-covered wool were huddled on his porch. One was slumped against the doorframe, motionless. The other was pounding on the wood with a gloved fist. Davis unlatched the heavy oak bar and shoved the door open. The wind slammed into the room, extinguishing the lantern on the table and sending sparks flying from the fireplace. "Get in," he barked, grabbing the standing woman by the arm and hauling her inside. He reached down for the second figure, a smaller woman who was barely conscious, and lifted her as easily as if she were a sack of grain. He kicked the door shut and barred it again. The silence that returned to the cabin was heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of the 2 intruders. The woman who had been pounding on the door pulled back the hood of her heavy cloak. She was striking, even with her face red from the cold. She had sharp features, dark eyes that darted around the room, assessing everything, and hair the color of midnight. This was Beatrice Sterling. We lost the trail," Beatrice stammered, her teeth chattering violently. She moved toward the fire, rubbing her hands together. "Our wagon threw a wheel 3 miles back. The horse bolted." Davis ignored her explanation. He laid the second woman on the bearskin rug near the hearth. He pulled back her hood. She was younger than the first, with pale, delicate skin and hair the color of wheat straw. Her lips were blue. This was Clara O'Malley. "She's freezing to death," Davis said flatly. He moved with a surprising efficiency, grabbing a rough wool blanket from his cot and wrapping it around Clara. "Get that wet cloak off her." Beatrice hesitated, looking at Davis with suspicion. "Who are you? They said there was a trapper up here, a hermit. I'm the man whose fire you're stealing." Davis grunted. "Take off the wet clothes, or she dies. I'll turn my back." Davis walked to the small kitchenette area, pumping water from the indoor cistern into a kettle. He could hear the rustle of wet fabric and hushed, frantic whispers. "Beatrice, I can't feel my feet," Clara whimpered. "Hush, you fool. We're safe for now," Beatrice hissed back. Davis's jaw tightened. He knew that tone. It wasn't the tone of a grieving widow or a terrified traveler. It was the tone of a conspirator. He turned back around when the rustling stopped. Both women were now wrapped in his spare blankets, huddled as close to the fire as they could get without burning themselves. "My name is Beatrice," the dark-haired woman said, trying to regain some composure. She straightened her spine, attempting to look like the lady she clearly thought she was. "And this is Clara. We're We are widows. Our husband died in Cheyenne 2 weeks ago. We were traveling to my sister's in Idaho when the storm hit. Davis poured hot water into 2 tin cups and dropped in some dried mint leaves. He handed the cups to them. Widows? He asked, his voice skeptical. Both of you? Beatrice stiffened. It is a complicated situation. We were both married to Josiah Sterling. We only found out about each other after his heart gave out. Davis stared at them. A bigamist. It wasn't uncommon in the West, where men could reinvent themselves by crossing a state line. But for the 2 wives to be traveling together? That was rare. 2 widows, Davis repeated, leaning against the stone chimney. Traveling through a blizzard in the worst winter in 10 years. With no guide, no supplies. We had supplies, Clara piped up, her voice trembling. She held the tin cup with both hands, the steam bringing a little color back to her cheeks. She had wide, innocent blue eyes that seemed to plead for kindness. The horse ran off with them. Please, sir. We just need shelter until the storm passes. Davis looked from Beatrice, who looked like she was calculating the value of the furniture, to Clara, who looked like she would break if you touched her. I have 1 bed, Davis said. You take it. I sleep on the floor. Thank you, Clara breathed. You're a good man. Your wife must worry when you're out in this weather. The cabin went silent. The wind outside seemed to stop for a heartbeat. Davis's face darkened, the shadows from the fire casting his features into a skull-like relief. He stepped closer to them, towering over the 2 women. I never had a wife, Davis said. His voice was low, but it carried a weight that made Beatrice flinch. And I don't keep guests. You stay until the snow stops. Then you leave. If you steal anything, I'll leave you to the wolves. If you lie to me again, I'll leave you to the wolves. We aren't lying, Beatrice insisted, though her eyes shifted away. Everyone lies, Davis muttered, turning back to his whittling. Especially widows who arrive with empty hands and full stories. 3 days passed, and the storm did not break. The snow piled up against the windows, turning the cabin into a dim, claustrophobic cave lit only by the fireplace and kerosene lamps. The dynamic in the small cabin was suffocating. Davis Blackwood was a man of routine, and these 2 women were chaos incarnate. Beatrice was restless. She paced the small floor, touching everything. She picked up the silver frame on the mantel, face down, and tried to peek at it, but Davis snatched it from her hand before she could see the image. She complained about the food venison stew and hardtack, complained about the draft, and complained about Clara. Clara, on the other hand, was trying too hard to be useful. She attempted to sweep the floor, but her hands were soft, unaccustomed to the rough straw broom. She tried to mend Davis's torn shirt, but her stitching was crooked. You've never worked a day in your life, have you? Davis asked on the second evening. He was skinning a rabbit on the table, the gore stark against the wood. Clara flinched at the sight of the knife. Josiah, he took care of everything. He was a wealthy man. He owned the copper mines in Butte. And he married you both? Davis asked, not looking up. I was the first wife, Beatrice interjected sharply from the corner. Married in Boston 10 years ago. Clara was the mistake. Married 6 months ago in Denver. I didn't know, Clara cried, tears welling in her eyes. He told me he was a widower. He showed me a grave. He was a liar, Clara. We've established that, Beatrice snapped, and now he's dead, and we are stuck here in this hovel with a mute savage. Davis slammed the knife into the table. The blade vibrated with a humming sound. Both women froze. This savage is the only reason you aren't frozen corpses, Davis said calmly. And this hovel is the only thing between you and God's judgment. He wiped his hands on her and walked to the window, peering out into the white abyss. He felt a strange prickling on the back of his neck. He had been watching the tree line earlier that morning and had seen something that unsettled him. Tracks. Not animal tracks. They were faint, quickly filled by the snow, but they were there. Someone was out there, or something. Why are you really here? Davis asked, turning back to them. We told you, Beatrice said, crossing her arms. No, you told me a story, Davis said. Women like you don't travel alone across the Bitterroots just to go to a sister's house. You take the train. You take the stagecoach. You don't buy a wagon and drive it yourself unless you're running from something. Clara looked down at her hands. Beatrice glared at him. Josiah left debts, Beatrice lied smoothly. Gambling debts. Bad men were coming for the estate. We had to leave quickly to protect our assets. Assets, Davis repeated. He looked at the heavy leather satchel Beatrice kept by her feet at all times. She slept with it. She took it with her when she went behind the privacy curtain to wash. That bag seems heavy for clothes. Personal effects, Beatrice said icily. Later that night, the tension boiled over. Davis had taken the floor, rolling up in his bedroll near the door. The women shared the narrow cot. Around midnight, Davis woke. He didn't move a muscle, his breathing remaining slow and steady, but his eyes were open. He heard the rustle of fabric. Clara was weeping softly. "Stop it," Beatrice hissed in the dark. "You'll wake him." "I can't do this, Bea," Clara whispered. "He knows. He looks at me and he sees right through me. What if he finds the notice?" "He won't find the notice because you burned it, didn't you?" I think so." "You think so? You stupid girl. If Sheriff Brody catches us, we hang. Do you understand? We hang." Davis lay perfectly still. Sheriff Brody. He knew that name. Sheriff Nathan Brody was the law in Bitter Creek, a town 50 miles south. Brody was a snake in a tin star, a man who sold justice to the highest bidder. If Brody was chasing them, these women weren't just debtors. They were criminals. But there was something else. The name Josiah Sterling. It gnawed at Davis. He felt he had heard it before, years ago, in a life he had tried to forget. Davis closed his eyes, but he didn't sleep. He gripped the handle of the knife hidden under his pillow. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing inside his cabin. Morning broke with a deceptive calm. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world a blinding, brilliant white. The silence was absolute. "I'm going to check the trap lines," Davis announced, pulling on his heavy buffalo hide coat. He strapped his revolver to his hip. "Stay inside. If you see anyone coming up the ridge, you bar the door and you don't open it unless you hear my voice. Understand?" "Is there danger?" Clara asked, her eyes wide with fear. "There's always danger," Davis said. He looked at Beatrice. "Especially when you're carrying personal effects that weigh 20 pounds. He left before she could retort. As soon as the door clicked shut, Beatrice scrambled out of the bed. "What are you doing?" Clara asked, pulling the blanket up to her chin. "Searching the place," Beatrice said. "He has a gun cabinet. We need a weapon. If Brody comes, that mountain man won't protect us. He'll trade us for a bounty." "He saved us! Beatrice! He gave us his bed! He's a man, Clara. Men do things for a price." "We need to know what his price is." Beatrice began rummaging through Davis's meager belongings. She opened the cupboards, checked the loose floorboards. She found nothing of value, just simple tools, preserved food, and books. "He reads," Beatrice muttered, picking up a copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. Strange for a savage. Meanwhile, Clara walked over to the mantelpiece. She was drawn to the silver picture frame Davis had hidden the day before. It was lying face down on a high shelf. Her curiosity got the better of her. She reached up on her tiptoes and tipped the frame forward. She gasped. It was a tintype photograph. A younger Davis stood stiffly in a formal suit, his hand resting on the shoulder of a seated woman. The woman was beautiful, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. On her lap sat a baby boy. But it wasn't the woman that made Clara gasp. It was the man standing next to Davis. There were two men in the photo, Davis and another man. A man with a charming, crooked smile and a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow. "Beatrice," Clara whispered. "Look." Beatrice abandoned her search and came over. She looked at the photo and her face went pale. "That's Josiah," she breathed. "It's him," Clara said, trembling. "Younger, but it's him. The scar. That's Josiah Sterling." "Why does this hermit have a picture of our husband?" Beatrice asked, her voice rising in panic. Just then, the door creaked. They hadn't heard Davis return. Davis stood in the doorway, snow falling from his shoulders. He held 2 dead pheasants in one hand. His eyes went from the women to the picture frame in Clara's hand. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Davis dropped the birds. He walked over to Clara, his steps heavy and deliberate. He gently took the frame from her shaking hands and set it back down, face down. "I told you not to touch that," he said softly. "You knew him," Beatrice accused, backing away until she hit the table. "You knew Josiah. Who are you? Are you working with him?" Davis turned to look at them. The pain in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, burning rage. Working with him? Davis laughed, a dry, humorless sound. I created him. He walked to the fire and warmed his hands. His name wasn't Josiah Sterling when I knew him. His name was Thomas Blackwood, my younger brother. The two women stood frozen. Your husband, Davis said, turning to face them, was a thief, a liar, and a murderer. 10 years ago, he stole my inheritance, seduced my wife, and left me for dead in a burning barn. I survived. My wife and son did not. Davis took a step closer to Beatrice. So tell me, widow, did he die of a heart attack? Or did one of you finally put a knife in his black heart? Beatrice swallowed hard. She looked at the heavy leather bag. He didn't die of a heart attack, she whispered. Clara shot him. Clara let out a sob and collapsed to her knees. Davis looked at the weeping girl, then at the hard-eyed woman. Good, he said. Suddenly, a gunshot echoed through the valley outside, then another. Davis moved instantly, blowing out the lantern and grabbing his rifle. He moved to the window. Who is it? Beatrice asked, terrified. Davis peered through the crack. Down in the valley, black dots were moving against the snow. Riders, 5 of them. Leading the pack was a man on a large gray stallion. Even from this distance, Davis recognized the way the man sat in the saddle. It's Sheriff Brody, Davis said. And he's not alone. He's got the bounty hunters from Cheyenne with him. He turned to the women. You didn't just kill my brother. You stole something from him, didn't you? Something Brody wants. Beatrice clutched the bag. The deed, she confessed. The deed to the Copperhead mine. And $50,000 in bearer bonds. Davis cursed. $50,000. That's enough to make a sheriff burn this whole mountain down. Will you help us? Clara begged from the floor. Please. He was a monster. He beat us. He was going to sell me to a brothel in San Francisco. Davis looked at the picture on the mantel, the memory of his wife and child. Then he looked at Clara, young and terrified, reminding him of the innocence he lost. Get in the cellar, Davis ordered, lifting a heavy rug to reveal a trapdoor. Stay quiet. If they come in, I'll handle them. Why? Beatrice asked, pausing at the trapdoor. Why help us? Because Davis cocked his rifle. If Thomas is dead, I can't kill him. But I can sure as hell kill the men who protected him. The heavy oak door shuddered under the force of a gloved fist. Davis stood 4 feet back, his Winchester leveled at the wood. The trapdoor to the cellar was covered by the bearskin rug, invisible to the untrained eye. Davis! A voice boomed from outside, muffled by the timber but unmistakably arrogant. I know you're in there, you old badger. Open up. It's the law. Davis didn't answer. He let the silence stretch, a tactic to make the men outside nervous. He could hear the creak of leather saddles and the stomp of horses in the snow. Come on now, Davis, Sheriff Brody called, his voice tighter this time. We saw the smoke. We know you're home. We're tracking 2 fugitives, dangerous women, murderesses. Davis unbarred the door slowly. He opened it a crack, keeping his body shielded behind the heavy frame. The sunlight reflecting off the snow was blinding, but Davis didn't blink. Sheriff Nathan Brody sat on his gray stallion, looking every inch the corrupt king of the county. He wore a shearling coat that cost more than Davis's cabin, and a silver star pinned to his chest that shone with a false luster. Behind him were 4 men, hired guns, not deputies. Davis recognized One-Eyed Jack and a tracker named Cole. These weren't men you brought to make an arrest. They were men you brought to dig shallow graves. Sheriff, Davis nodded, his voice gravel. You're a long way from your warm office. Duty calls Blackwood, Brody smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. We're looking for a wagon. 2 women, 1 dark, 1 fair. They killed a prominent businessman in Cheyenne. Robbed him blind. A businessman? Davis asked, feigning ignorance. Or a swindler? Brody's smile faltered. Careful, Davis. That man was a friend of the territory. Josiah Sterling. Never heard of him, Davis lied smoothly. And I haven't seen any women. Just snow and wolves. Brody leaned forward on his saddle horn. Is that right? Because my tracker found wheel ruts about 3 miles back. They disappear near the ridge, and your chimney is smoking awful heavy for 1 man. I like it warm, Davis said. If you're done accusing me, get off my land. The wind's picking up. Brody signaled to his men. They dismounted. hands hovering over their holsters. "I think we'll come in and warm up, Davis. Maybe take a look around. Just to be sure. You cross that threshold without a warrant, and you'll leave feet first," Davis warned, cocking the lever of his rifle. The sound was crisp and loud in the frozen air. Brody laughed, but it was a cold sound. "You think you can take 5 of us? You're a washed-up hermit, Blackwood. A ghost." "Maybe," Davis said, "but ghosts are hard to kill." "Burn it," Brody ordered, his voice losing all pretense of civility. One of the hired guns lit a torch. Davis didn't hesitate. He fired. The bullet took the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping the torch into the snow. The horses reared, screaming. The peaceful standoff shattered instantly into chaos. Davis kicked the door shut and slammed the bar down just as a hail of bullets splintered the wood. He dove to the floor, glass from the window shattering above him as lead tore through the cabin. "Stay down!" Davis roared toward the trapdoor, hoping the women could hear him over the gunfire. He crawled to the gun ports, small, removable chinking logs he had built into the walls for exactly this reason. He pushed one out and peered through. The men had taken cover behind the trees and the woodpile. They were pinned down, but they had numbers. "You're a dead man! Blackwood!" Brody screamed from behind a boulder. "And when we're done with you, we're going to drag those women out by their hair and hang them from your porch." Davis grabbed a box of ammunition from the shelf. He wasn't fighting for his home anymore. He was fighting for the 2 women beneath the floorboards who had killed the brother he hated. Suddenly, the trapdoor pushed up. Davis spun around, gun raised. Beatrice climbed out, coughing in the dust and smoke. She held the heavy revolver Beatrice had found in the satchel. "Get back down!" Davis barked. "No," Beatrice said, her eyes fierce. "Clara is praying. I'm done praying. I know how to shoot." Davis looked at her. He saw the tremble in her hands, but the steel in her jaw. She reminded him of his wife. Not in looks, but in spirit. "Fine," Davis pointed to the rear window. "Keep your head down. If anyone tries to flank us from the ridge, put a bullet in them." "With pleasure," Beatrice said, crawling to the position. The cabin, once a sanctuary of silence against the mountain wind, had transformed into a cage of deafening noise and choking smoke. The initial exchange of gunfire had shattered 2 of the windows, and the freezing wind now whipped through the interior, swirling the acrid gray smoke of gunpowder into blinding eddies. Davis Blackwood moved with the economy of a man who had long expected to die violently. He didn't run. He slid from cover to cover, his boots crunching on broken glass. He pressed his back against the rough log wall near the east-facing gun port. "They're spreading out," Davis rasped, his voice tight. He levered a fresh round into the chamber of his Winchester 1873. Brody isn't stupid. He knows a frontal assault against a fortified position is suicide. He's sending his dogs to the flanks. "What does that mean?" Beatrice asked. She was crouched behind the overturned oak table, the heavy Colt revolver gripped in both hands. Her face was smudged with soot, her expensive dress torn at the shoulder, but her eyes, those dark, calculating eyes, were wide open. "It means they want to crossfire us," Davis explained, peering through the chinking. "If they get angles on both windows, there's nowhere in this room to hide. We'll be fish in a barrel." Outside, the crack of a rifle echoed off the canyon walls. A bullet punched through the wood just inches from Davis's head, sending a spray of sharp splinters into his cheek. He didn't flinch. He tracked the muzzle flash in the tree line, exhaled a breath of steam, and squeezed the trigger. Crack! A scream of pain erupted from the pines. "One hit," Davis muttered grimly. "Leg shot. He's out of the fight." But the victory was short-lived. From the western side of the cabin, the heavy boom of a buffalo gun thundered. A slug the size of a thumb tore through the shutters, smashing the kerosene lamp on the mantel. Oil splashed onto the stone hearth, flaring up instantly, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. "Beatrice!" Davis roared over the din. "The west window! Keep their heads down! You don't have to hit them! Just make them afraid to peek out!" Beatrice scrambled across the floor, dragging her heavy skirts. She propped the heavy revolver on the sill of the west window. She was trembling, not from the cold, but from the raw, terrifying adrenaline coursing through her veins. She thought of the tea parties in Boston, the polite conversations about embroidery. Those seemed like a dream from another life. Here, in the blood and the snow, was the only reality that mattered. She saw movement behind a boulder. She fired. The recoil bucked her arms back violently, nearly knocking the gun from her grip, but the shot kicked up a geyser of snow right next to the attacker's boot. The man dove back for cover. "I did it!" she yelled, a strange, savage thrill piercing her fear. "Keep shooting!" Davis commanded. "Make them think we're a regiment!" Down in the cellar, beneath the trapdoor covered by the bearskin rug, Clara O'Malley huddled in the darkness. The floorboards above her creaked and groaned under the boots of the defenders. Every gunshot sounded like a hammer blow to her chest. She clutched her rosary so tight the beads cut into her palms, but she wasn't just praying. Her other hand gripped the handle of a heavy cast-iron skillet she had snatched from the stove before descending. If they came down here, she decided, she wouldn't die screaming. She would die fighting for her unborn child. Back in the main room, the dynamic of the battle shifted. The shooting from outside slowed. "Why did they stop?" Beatrice whispered, her ears ringing in the sudden quiet. Davis's eyes darted to the ceiling. "They didn't stop. They moved. Hump." A heavy boot landed on the roof shingles. Then another. Then the scraping sound of bodies dragging themselves up the pitch of the cabin. "They're on the roof," Davis hissed. "They're going to drop dynamite down the chimney or tear up the shakes to shoot us from above." Davis dropped his rifle. It was useless for close quarters. He lunged across the room to the wall rack and grabbed a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun. It was an ugly, brutal weapon, cut down for ease of handling. He moved to the center of the room, tracking the sounds of the footsteps above. Dust trickled down from the ceiling boards, marking the intruder's path. Davis cocked both hammers. The clicks were loud, mechanical, and final. He aimed the barrels straight up at the wooden ceiling. "Get down!" he shouted to Beatrice. Boom! He fired both barrels simultaneously. The recoil was enough to bruise his shoulder bone, but the effect was devastating. The buckshot shredded the pine planks of the roof, blasting a jagged hole through the wood and shingles. A garbled cry of agony pierced the air, followed by the sickening sound of a body losing its grip. The man rolled down the steep pitch of the roof, his fingernails scratching uselessly against the wood before thudding heavily in the snowbank below. "One down," Davis growled, breaking the shotgun open to eject the smoking shells. But the roof attack had been a diversion. While Davis's eyes were cast upward, the front door groaned under a massive impact. Crun H. The heavy oak bar Davis had carved himself began to splinter. They were using a battering ram, likely a log from Davis's own woodpile. Crun H. "They're breaching!" Beatrice screamed, scrambling back toward the hearth. "Get behind the table!" Davis yelled, throwing the empty shotgun aside. He didn't have time to reload. He drew the Colt Peacemaker from his hip and unsheathed the long Bowie knife on his belt. The door didn't just open, it exploded inward. Wood fragments flew like shrapnel as the hinges gave way. The freezing twilight rushed in, carrying two silhouettes with it. First came One-Eyed Jack, a notorious gunslinger from Cheyenne. He stepped over the threshold, a revolver in each hand, scanning the room for targets. Beatrice didn't hesitate. From her position behind the overturned table, she fired. It was a lucky shot, guided by panic and instinct. The bullet took Jack in the thigh, spinning him around. He fired wildly into the ceiling as he collapsed, his legs shattering. Davis stepped out of the shadows. He fanned the hammer of his Colt. Bang, bang, putting 2 rounds into Jack's chest before the man hit the floor. But behind Jack was the real threat, Cole. Cole was a tracker, a giant of a man who stood 6'6", wearing a coat made of wolf skins. He didn't have a gun drawn. He held a knife that looked more like a short sword. He saw Davis and charged. Davis fired his last round, but Cole moved with shocking speed for a man of his size. The bullet grazed Cole's ribs, but it didn't stop his momentum. Cole crashed into Davis like a runaway freight train. The impact drove the air from Davis's lungs. Both men went flying backward, crashing into the shelves of canned goods. Tin cans rained down on them as they grappled on the floor. Davis was strong, hardened by 20 years of chopping wood and hauling game, but Cole was a monster in his prime. Cole's hand clamped around Davis's throat, squeezing with hydraulic pressure. Davis saw black spots dancing in his vision. "You're done, old man," Cole grunted, his breath smelling of chewing tobacco and rot. He raised his knife to deliver the killing blow. Davis couldn't breathe. He couldn't speak. He thrashed, his legs kicking out, knocking over a bucket of water. "Use the anger," a voice inside him whispered. "Use the hate." Davis released his grip on Cole's wrist and jammed his thumb into Cole's eye socket. Cole roared, his head jerking back in reflex. The pressure on Davis's throat loosened for a fraction of a second, just enough. Davis bucked his hips, unseating the giant, and rolled them over. They scrambled to their feet, gasping, circling each other in the wreckage of the cabin. The firelight flickered off their blades. "I'm going to skin you, Blackwood," Cole sneered, blood running down his face from his injured eye. "And then I'm going to have my fun with the widows." That was the wrong thing to say. Something ancient and terrible woke up inside Davis Blackwood. He wasn't fighting a man. He was fighting the ghost of his brother, the ghost of his failures, the ghost of every injustice he had ever suffered. Cole lunged. Davis didn't block. He stepped into the attack. He took Cole's blade through the fleshy part of his left forearm, trapping the weapon with his own bone and muscle. Cole's eyes went wide. He hadn't expected the sacrifice. With Cole's weapon trapped in his arm, Davis drove his own Bowie knife upward, under the ribs, aiming for the heart. He twisted the blade. Cole stiffened. The giant's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at Davis with a look of profound confusion, as if he couldn't understand how a lonely hermit had bested him. Davis shoved him away. Cole took one step back, then two, before his knees buckled. He crashed onto the bare rug, right on top of the trapdoor, dead before he hit the ground. Davis stood swaying, his chest heaving. Blood dripped steadily from his left arm, pooling on the floorboards. The room was silent now, save for the crackling of the fire and the wind whistling through the shattered door. "Davis?" Beatrice's voice was small, trembling. She slowly rose behind the table, her face pale as death. She looked at the bodies littering the floor. Davis ripped a strip of cloth from the tablecloth and wrapped it tightly around his bleeding arm, gritting his teeth against the pain. He walked to the door, stepping over the wreckage of the men who had come to kill them. He looked out into the snow. The silence outside was heavier than the silence inside. The hired guns were dead or fled. "Is it over?" Beatrice asked, walking up behind him, staring at the carnage. "No," Davis said, his voice a low growl. He reloaded his Colt, his bloody fingers slick on the brass cartridges. "The hired help is gone, but the man who paid them is still out there." He stepped out onto the porch, into the blue twilight of the frozen world. "And he's the only one that matters." The wind had died down, leaving the valley suspended in a terrifying, frozen stillness. The sun had dipped below the jagged peaks of the Tetons, casting the world in a deep, bruising shade of indigo. It was the blue hour, that deceptive time of day when shadows lengthened and depth perception failed. Davis Blackwood stepped out onto the porch. The cold air bit into his exposed skin, stinging the fresh cut on his forehead and searing the open wound on his arm. He didn't feel the cold, though. He was burning up with adrenaline and a decade of suppressed rage. He kicked a loose shell casing off the deck boards. It clattered loudly, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the vast emptiness. "Brody!" Davis shouted. His voice was raw, scraped violently against his throat. "Your dogs are dead! Sheriff! It's just you and me now!" There was no answer, just the creak of the pine trees under the weight of the snow. "Don't make me come find you," Davis warned, stepping down the stairs into the knee-deep drift. He held his Colt Peacemaker loosely at his side, hammer cocked. "You wanted the deed? You wanted the gold? Come and take it." Movement caught his eye near the large oak tree, 50 yards out at the edge of the clearing. A shadow detached itself from the darkness. Sheriff Nathan Brody stepped into the pale moonlight. He looked less like a lawman and more like a cornered rat. His expensive shearling coat was disheveled, his hat missing. He was breathing hard, condensing white plumes of steam into the air. "You're a hard man to kill, Blackwood," Brody yelled back, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and bravado. "I'll give you that. I thought you were just a broken-down hermit. Seems I was misinformed." "Thomas was a liar," Davis said, walking slowly toward him. "He surrounded himself with liars. Guess that includes you." Brody laughed, but it was a jagged, hysterical sound. Josiah, Thomas, whoever he was a genius. He found the vein, Blackwood, the mother lode, enough gold to buy the governor's mansion. And you think I'm going to let 2 whores and a ghost take that from me? Brody's hand moved. He wasn't reaching for his holster. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick, red cylinder. Dynamite. Davis stopped walking. At this distance, a pistol was a gamble. Dynamite was a certainty. "I don't need to outdraw you, Davis!" Brody screamed, his eyes wild. He struck a match against the rough bark of the oak tree. The flame flared bright orange, illuminating his manic grin. "I just need to turn that cabin into a crater! If I can't have the deed, nobody can! No!" Beatrice screamed from the doorway behind Davis. Brody touched the flame to the fuse. It sputtered and hissed, sparking violently in the gloom. "Go to hell, Blackwood!" Brody reared his arm back, preparing to hurl the explosive. Time seemed to warp for Davis. The world narrowed down to a tunnel. He couldn't run. His legs were heavy with fatigue. He couldn't dive. The blast radius would catch him in the front of the cabin. He raised the Colt. His hand was shaking. The blood loss from his arm was taking its toll. The sights of the gun blurred against the dark backdrop of the trees. He thought of Marie, his wife. He thought of the son he never got to raise. He thought of Clara and the innocent life she carried. Steady, the voice in his head whispered. It was the same voice that had kept him alive through 10 brutal winters. Breathe. Davis exhaled. The shake in his hand ceased for a fraction of a second. He didn't aim for Brody's chest. He aimed for the sparking light in Brody's hand. Bang! The gunshot cracked through the valley, sharp and final. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the world turned white. The stick of dynamite detonated in Brody's hand before he could release it. A thunderous roar shattered the night, shaking the snow from the trees for miles around. A plume of fire, dirt, wood splinters, and red mist erupted upward, momentarily turning the night back into day. The shockwave hit Davis like a physical blow, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward into the snowbank. Debris rained down. Clumps of earth, shredded branches, and pieces of the sheriff's expensive coat. Then, silence returned. Absolute, ringing silence. Davis lay in the snow, staring up at the first stars appearing in the sky. His ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine. He wiggled his fingers. He was alive. He felt hands grabbing his coat. "Davis! Davis!" It was Clara. She had crawled out of the cellar during the fight and run out into the snow, heedless of the cold. She was clutching the heavy iron skillet she had planned to use as a weapon. Davis sat up, groaning. He looked toward the oak tree. The tree was gone. In its place was a smoking crater and blackened snow. Sheriff Brody was no longer a problem. "Is he—" Clara's voice trembled. "He's gone," Davis rasped, spitting out a mouthful of blood and snow. "He's gone." Beatrice walked down the steps. She moved slowly, like a sleepwalker waking from a nightmare. She looked at the crater, then at the dead men on her porch, and finally at Davis. She knelt beside him in the snow. She didn't care about the blood on his shirt or the grime on his face. She reached out and took his hand, the hand that had fired the shot. Her grip was iron strong. "You saved us," she whispered, her dark eyes searching his face. "I settled a debt," Davis corrected her, his voice weary but lighter than it had been in years. "Thomas, Josiah, he owed me this. He owed us all. He's paid in full," Beatrice said firmly. Davis looked at the two women, one dark and sharp, one fair and soft. They were battered, terrified, and freezing, but they were alive. "Come on," Davis said, struggling to his feet with their help. "Let's go inside. It's going to be a cold night, and we need to board up that door." As they limped back toward the warmth of the hearth, leaving the carnage behind them, Davis Blackwood realized something strange. For the first time since the fire that took his family, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. Spring didn't arrive in the Bitterroot Mountains with a whisper. It arrived with the roar of melting rivers and the cracking of ice. It was mid-May before the heavy drifts that had entombed the cabin finally receded, revealing the scarred earth beneath. The cabin itself bore the wounds of the winter siege. The front door was new, built of thick, reinforced oak that Davis had planed himself. The roof had been patched with fresh cedar shakes, their reddish hue standing out against the weathered gray of the old timber. But the most startling change wasn't the structure. It was the life that now surrounded it. Davis Blackwood stood by the rough-hewn fence, leaning on a shovel. He watched the small patch of tilled earth where Clara O'Malley was on her knees, carefully planting vegetable seeds. Clara had changed. The fragile, terrified girl who had collapsed on his doorstep was gone. In her place was a woman blooming with motherhood. Her pregnancy was well advanced now, her belly a round prominence against her calico dress. She hummed as she worked, a soft, melodic sound that seemed to chase away the lingering ghosts of the valley. The door to the cabin opened, and Beatrice stepped out. If Clara was the heart of their strange little family, Beatrice was the spine. She carried 2 tin cups of steaming coffee, walking with a stride that was no longer tentative. She wore one of Davis's old flannel shirts, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, and a long skirt she had hemmed herself. The Boston socialite who had complained about the draft was dead. A woman of the frontier had taken her place. She handed a cup to Davis, her fingers brushing his. The contact sent a jolt through him that he wasn't used to. "She's resilient," Beatrice said, nodding toward Clara. "Stronger than I gave her credit for. She had to be," Davis replied, a sip of the bitter black coffee. "Winter up here kills the weak. You know that better than anyone." Beatrice leaned against the fence, looking out at the majestic peaks of the Tetons. "We went down to Cheyenne last week," she said, her voice turning serious. "The lawyers were accommodating." Davis nodded. He knew the story. With the snow melted, the women had made the trek to the capital, not as fugitives, but as victors. They carried the deed to the Copperhead mine and the evidence of Sheriff Brody's corruption. "The mine is yours, then?" Davis asked. "Ours," Beatrice corrected. "Clara and I are partners. The gold vein Thomas found, it's real, Davis. It's the biggest strike in the territory. We are wealthy women." Davis looked down at his calloused hands. "Money doesn't fix everything." "No," Beatrice agreed softly. "But it builds things. We're using the first yield to build a school in Bitter Creek and an orphanage." She paused, turning to look him directly in the eyes. "We're going to name it the Marie Blackwood Home." Davis froze. The cup halted halfway to his mouth. He looked at Beatrice, his gray eyes suddenly shining with unshed tears. For a decade, he had not spoken his dead wife's name. He had buried it deep, fearing the pain would break him. Now, hearing it spoken with such reverence, he felt something inside him unlock. "You don't have to do that," he choked out. "We want to," Beatrice said firmly. "She's the reason you saved us. She deserves to be remembered." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the chirping of a bluebird. "We have to go back to town soon," Beatrice said eventually. "Clara needs a doctor for the birth, and I have to manage the mining crews." Davis felt a hollow ache in his chest. He had spent 10 years craving solitude. Now, the prospect of an empty cabin terrified him. "I suppose you do," he muttered. Beatrice took a step closer to him. The scent of pine and lavender water drifted from her hair. "The town is noisy, Davis. It's dirty and full of people who talk too much." "Sounds like hell," Davis said. "It is," she smiled, a genuine, dazzling expression that softened the sharp angles of her face. "I was thinking, I'll need to inspect the mine often, but I need a foreman, someone I can trust, someone who can keep the wolves away." Davis looked at her. He saw the scars of her past, the strength she had forged in the fire of that winter, and the undeniable pull between them. They were 2 broken people who had found a way to fit their jagged edges together perfectly. "I'm not much for giving orders to men," Davis said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You won't have to," Beatrice countered, stepping into his personal space. "Just keep me safe. Can you do that?" "I reckon I can," Davis whispered. Beatrice reached up, placing her hand on his bearded cheek. "Good!" She kissed him then. It wasn't the tentative kiss of a new romance. It was the searing, desperate seal of a bond forged in blood and survival. It tasted of coffee and promise. Down in the garden, Clara stood up, wiping the dirt from her hands. She saw them by the fence and smiled, resting a hand on her unborn child. The wind shifted, blowing warm from the south. The Lonely Mountain Man was a title that belonged to the past. Davis Blackwood had found his redemption, not in revenge, but in the shelter he gave to 2 strangers. The winter was over. The ice had finally broken. And for the first time in a lifetime, Davis Blackwood was looking forward to tomorrow. The legend of Davis Blackwood and the widows of Bitterroot Ridge is still whispered in the Wyoming high country. It is a story that reminds us that karma isn't just a force of nature. Sometimes, it's a man with a rifle and a broken heart. Davis thought his life ended when he lost his family, but fate brought him 2 women who needed saving just as much as he did. They didn't just survive the storm, they conquered the past that haunted them. In the end, the lonely mountain man found a family not by blood, but by bond. He learned that while you cannot change the past, you can certainly fight for the future. If you enjoyed this story of justice, revenge, and redemption in the Wild West, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story. What do you think? Did Davis make the right choice? Let me know in the comments below.